Thomas was a solitary man of 32, weathered by years of working the unforgiving land, his hands calloused from mending fences and his heart heavy with the loneliness that came from choosing isolation over the crowded eastern cities he'd left behind. He stood on his porch that evening watching two figures approach from the direction of the Apache territories, their silhouettes growing larger against the crimson sky, and something in his chest tightened with both caution and curiosity. As they drew closer, Thomas realized these were not ordinary travelers. These were two Apache women, and their height was extraordinary, both standing well over 6 feet tall, their broad shoulders and powerful frames moving with a grace that defied their imposing size. The taller of the two, who Thomas would later learn was called Nalin, stood at least 6 feet 4 inches, her dark eyes scanning his property with an intelligence that immediately commanded respect, while her sister Kimmy, only slightly shorter at 6 feet 2, watched him with a wariness that spoke of past betrayals. Thomas raised his hand in a peaceful gesture, his heart hammering against his ribs, knowing that relations between settlers and the Apache had been strained at best, violent at worst, and any wrong move could end badly for everyone involved. The sisters stopped 20 feet from his porch, their buckskin dresses dusty from travel, their faces showing the exhaustion of a long journey, and Nalin spoke first in broken English, her voice deep and resonant, asking simply for water and perhaps something to eat. Most ranchers in the territory would have turned them away or worse, reached for their rifles, but Thomas had never been like most men, and something in their dignified stance, despite their obvious hunger and fatigue, touched something deep within him. He gestured toward his well and then to his small dining table visible through the open door, speaking slowly and clearly that they were welcome to both water and a meal, that he had stew cooking and bread from that morning, more than enough for 3 people. The sisters exchanged glances, surprise flickering across their features, as if kindness from a white rancher was the last thing they'd expected to encounter on this desperate journey. And slowly, cautiously, they approached. Thomas ladled out generous portions of his beef stew, thick with potatoes and carrots from his small garden, and set out half a loaf of sourdough bread with fresh butter, watching as the women's eyes widened at the abundance he offered without hesitation or condition. They ate slowly at first, maintaining their dignity, but Thomas could see they were famished and he quietly refilled their bowls twice more, asking no questions, making no demands, simply offering the basic human decency of a shared meal between travelers. Nalin spoke more as the evening progressed, her English improving with confidence, explaining that they had been traveling for 3 days, separated from their band during a dispute with soldiers, trying to make their way back to their people in the mountains to the north. Thomas listened carefully, offering no judgment, no political commentary about the conflicts raging across the territory, simply acknowledging their struggle and the courage it took for 2 women, no matter how formidable, to cross such dangerous country alone. As darkness fell completely, Thomas brought out blankets and offered them his barn for the night, a safe place to sleep with fresh hay and shelter from the cold desert night that would soon descend, and the sisters accepted with solemn nods of gratitude. Kimmy spoke for the first time then, her voice softer than her sister's but no less powerful, saying in halting English that his kindness would be remembered, that the spirits would bless him for treating them with humanity when others had shown them only hatred and fear. Thomas waved away the thanks awkwardly, unused to praise or recognition, saying only that it was what any decent person should do, though they all knew that wasn't true, that decency had become a rare commodity in this blood-soaked territory. He returned to his house as the sisters settled into the barn, lying awake for hours wondering about the choice he'd made, knowing that if certain neighbors discovered he'd harbored Apache women, even peacefully, his reputation and perhaps his life could be at risk. But something about their dignity, their quiet strength in the face of such hardship, had touched a part of him that had been dormant for years, a reminder that humanity transcended the arbitrary lines drawn by race and conflict. The next morning, Thomas rose at dawn as always, started his coffee and stepped outside to find the barn empty, the blankets neatly folded, and the sisters gone like ghosts in the early morning mist that hung over the valley. He felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment, relieved that the risky situation had resolved peacefully, disappointed that he might never know what became of these remarkable women who had briefly entered his solitary world. Thomas went about his morning chores, feeding his horses and checking the fence line on the eastern pasture, trying to return to the familiar rhythm of his isolated existence, pushing the encounter to the back of his mind. But around midday, as he worked on repairing a section of his corral, he noticed dust rising in the distance, and soon he could make out not two figures, but more than a dozen. Riders approaching his ranch at a steady, purposeful pace. His hand instinctively moved toward his rifle, but something made him pause, perhaps the memory of Nalan's dignified bearing or Kimi's gentle words of blessing, and he waited on his porch as the riders drew near. The group was led by an older Apache man whose bearing and the deference shown by others immediately identified him as someone of great importance, a chief or senior leader, his weathered face marked with the lines of wisdom and hard-won authority. Behind him rode Nalan and Kimi, and flanking them were warriors and several other tribal members, their horses well-trained and their riders alert, but not openly hostile, which gave Thomas a small measure of hope that this wasn't a war party. The chief dismounted with surprising grace for his age, which Thomas estimated at somewhere past 60, and approached alone, his hands visible and empty of weapons, a gesture of peaceful intent that Thomas recognized and appreciated. Through Nalan, who now served as translator, the chief introduced himself as Victorio's cousin, a leader of a band that had been trying to maintain peace while watching their people slowly starve on inadequate reservation lands. He explained that his nieces, these two strong daughters of his deceased brother, had returned that morning with stories of the white rancher who had shown them unprecedented kindness, who had fed them generously and offered shelter without demanding anything in return, without even asking their names or business. The chief's dark eyes studied Thomas intently as Nalan translated, as if trying to understand what kind of man would take such a risk in these dangerous times, what motivated such unexpected compassion, when hatred had become the common language between their peoples. Thomas stood straighter under that scrutiny but didn't look away, meeting the chief's gaze with honest directness, saying simply through Nalan that they had been hungry and he had food, that it was the human thing to do. Nothing more complicated than that. The chief nodded slowly, and something like approval flickered across his weathered features. Then he spoke at length in Apache, his tone becoming more animated, more passionate, and Thomas waited with growing curiosity for Nalan's translation. What came next shocked Thomas to his core. The chief was offering him Nalan as a bride, his own niece, the taller of the two sisters, as a gesture of alliance and gratitude, a bond between their peoples represented through marriage, the highest honor the chief could bestow. Thomas felt his face flush hot, his mind racing with the implications, the complications, the sheer impossibility of what was being proposed, and he opened his mouth to refuse, to explain why this couldn't work, but Nalan's eyes stopped him. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, not pleading, not afraid, but something else, perhaps curiosity about what this unusual white man would do when faced with such an offer, whether his kindness extended beyond a single meal. The chief continued speaking, and Nalan translated that she was 26 years old, strong as any warrior, skilled in healing and farming, and that she had lost her husband 2 years ago in a raid by Mexican soldiers, leaving her without family except her sister and her uncle. He explained that the Apache way was changing, that survival meant adaptation, and that alliances with decent white men, rare as they were, might be the key to his people's survival, a bridge between the old world and the new. Thomas looked around at the assembled group, seeing hope on some faces, skepticism on others, and on Kimi's face, protective concern for her sister mixed with something that might have been approval of Thomas himself. He cleared his throat, buying time, his mind working through the monumental decision before him, knowing that accepting would change his life forever, make him an outcast among most white settlers, bind him to people who were considered enemies by his own government. But refusing might be seen as an insult, might undo whatever fragile bridge his simple act of kindness had built. And more than that, refusing meant turning away from something unprecedented, from a chance to choose a different path than the one of hatred and violence. Thomas asked through Nalan if he could speak with her privately, and after a moment's consultation with the chief, permission was granted. and they walked a short distance from the group, close enough to be seen but far enough for quiet conversation. He asked her directly in the simple English she understood, if this was what she wanted, or if she was being forced by her uncle's will, because he would not, could not, accept a bride who came to him without choice, without her own desire to be there. Nolan's response, delivered in her careful, measured English, surprised him with its honesty. She said she had watched him the night before, seen how he moved with no pretense, how he shared his food without calculating what he might gain, how he offered shelter without demanding gratitude or subservience. She said that among her people she was considered too tall, too strong, too outspoken, that Apache men wanted smaller, quieter wives, and that at 26, with no husband, she faced a future of being passed over, of becoming a burden to her aging uncle. But more than that, she said, she had seen something in Thomas that was rare in any man of any people, a genuine kindness that wasn't performing for others, a solitude that spoke of choice rather than rejection, and perhaps they were both outcasts who might make something good together. Thomas felt something shift in his chest at her words. This woman who stood 4 inches taller than his own 6 feet, who could probably outwork and outfight most men he knew, was offering herself not out of obligation, but out of a calculated assessment that they might suit each other. He asked her the practical questions then, about her willingness to live as a rancher's wife, about the hostility she would face from white settlers, about the loneliness of being separated from her people, wanting her to understand the reality of what this choice meant. Nolan answered each question with thoughtful consideration, acknowledging the challenges but pointing out that staying with her people meant watching them slowly starve and disappear, that perhaps building something new required courage to step into the unknown. Thomas made his decision then, not based on the chief's offer or the political implications, but based on the remarkable woman standing before him, who met his eyes as an equal and offered a partnership built on mutual respect rather than romantic illusions. They returned to the waiting group, and Thomas addressed the chief through Nolan's translation, saying that he would be honored to accept Nolan as his wife, but only if she came of her own free will, only if this was truly her choice, and he wanted that understood by everyone present. The chief's face broke into a broad smile, the first real expression of warmth Thomas had seen, and he spoke rapidly in Apache, and suddenly the assembled group was animated with voices raised in approval and celebration, the tension of the moment breaking like a summer storm. Kimmy embraced her sister, tears streaming down her strong features, and then surprised Thomas by embracing him as well, speaking in Apache words he didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear. A blessing, a warning to treat her sister well, a promise of family. The chief explained that they would return in 3 days for a proper ceremony that would honor both Apache and white traditions, that Nolan would stay with her people until then to prepare, and that Thomas should do the same, gathering whatever friends he trusted to witness this unprecedented union. As the group prepared to leave, Nolan approached Thomas one more time, and in full view of everyone, she took his hand, her grip strong and warm, her dark eyes searching his face, and she said in her careful English that she would be a good wife, a strong partner, and that she hoped he would never regret his choice. Thomas squeezed her hand back, surprised by how right it felt, despite how impossible the whole situation seemed, and he told her that he believed they would figure it out together. That partnership meant facing challenges as a team, and that he was ready for whatever came next. 3 days later, Thomas stood in his best clothes, cleaned and pressed, with the only 2 white neighbors who hadn't fled at the news of his impending Apache marriage, and he watched Nalan ride up with her people, dressed in ceremonial buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork that must have taken years to create. The ceremony itself was unlike anything Thomas had experienced, a blend of Apache traditions he barely understood, and simple vows spoken in 2 languages, witnessed by representatives of 2 worlds that were supposed to be at war, but were instead, for this brief moment, unified in hope. When it was done, when Nolan moved her few possessions into his ranch house, and the Apache party departed back toward their mountain stronghold, Thomas found himself standing with his new wife in the doorway of his home, both of them acutely aware of the enormous leap of faith they'd just taken. That first year was harder than either had anticipated, not because of their relationship, which developed into a deep partnership built on respect and growing affection, but because of the outside world's reaction to their union. White settlers who shunned them, Apache leaders who questioned Nalan's loyalty, and government officials who didn't know how to categorize their existence. But Nalan proved to be everything she'd promised, strong beyond measure, working beside Thomas in the fields and with the livestock, her height and strength making her an invaluable partner in the brutal work of ranching, while her knowledge of desert plants and healing herbs kept them both healthy through harsh seasons. Thomas, in turn, taught her to read and write English, to manage accounts and negotiate with the merchants in town who would still deal with them, treating her always as an equal partner in their enterprise rather than as property or subordinate. Kimmy visited often, and gradually other Apache families began to see the McKenna Ranch as a safe waypoint, a place where they could trade fairly and rest without fear, and Thomas's reputation grew in both communities as a man who kept his word and treated all people with dignity. When their first child was born 18 months after their marriage, a daughter who inherited her mother's height and her father's green eyes, Thomas held the tiny infant and marveled at how a simple act of sharing a meal had led to this, to family, to purpose, to a life richer than he'd ever imagined in his solitary existence. The territory around them continued its violent conflicts. The Apache Wars raged for years more, and many times Thomas and Nalan had to make hard choices about loyalty and survival. But they navigated those treacherous waters together, their partnership strengthened by each challenge weathered. Years later, when Thomas was asked by a visiting journalist how he'd come to marry an Apache woman, how such an unlikely union had come to be, he would always return to that first evening, to the simple choice to see two hungry travelers as human beings worthy of kindness rather than as enemies to be feared. He would say that sometimes the most important decisions in life come not from grand plans or careful calculations, but from small moments when we choose compassion over fear, humanity over hatred, and that everything good in his life had flowed from that one simple choice to share his table with strangers. The story of Thomas and Nalan became legend in the territory, a tale told to illustrate that even in the darkest times of conflict, bridges could be built between divided peoples, not through treaties or force, but through the basic human decency of recognizing our shared humanity. Their ranch stood for another 60 years, run eventually by their children and grandchildren, becoming a symbol of what was possible when people chose understanding over prejudice, when they had the courage to step across the lines that society drew and forge their own path based on respect and partnership. And it all began with two giant Apache sisters walking out of the desert sunset toward a lonely rancher who made the radical choice to see them not as threats, but as fellow human beings in need, a choice that changed not just his life, but demonstrated that even in divided times, one person's kindness could create ripples that lasted generations.